Thank you very much, and please welcome Veronique.
Hello. I'm going to try to be upbeat to talk about Homeland Security and the greatness of our Homeland Security policies here in Washington, D.C. I hope you're enjoying your lunch. Welcome to the Mercatus Center's series. I'm very pleased with this panel today. When Brian came and asked me who I thought we should invite to talk about Homeland Security, I said, I guess I took like a minute and I said, Cindy, John, and Clark, and here they are. So it's kind of like Christmas all over again. And you will, I think, these are like the people you want to talk to. We don't all agree, but we, I think, respect each other. And I think everyone is actually a very serious scholar and not just an ideologue. The risk of terrorism is seen and said to be like the biggest threat that the U.S. Faces today. To that effect, and to address this risk, Congress has appropriated a little over $350 billion since 9/11. The Homeland Security budget is going to be over $60 billion in 2008, and that represents an increase of 264% since 9/11. The Department of Homeland Security has a budget of $50 billion. I'm not going to go into how complicated I actually think those numbers are, because I think that one of the main problems that we have with Homeland Security activities that they're funding is that the spending is spread and it's all over the place. Most people don't see and understand that it's not all taking place through inside DHS, but actually the vast majority is taking place outside of DHS. Not that I'm necessarily in favor of it taking place inside of DHS, but it poses a lot of complexity and oversight problems. The question is, we're spending a lot of money, but what are we spending it on? And are we getting the biggest bang for our bucks, basically? Are we actually getting some security for the money that we're spending? And over the years, and we've had 5 or 6 years to actually look back and see what we're doing, a lot of people have actually been criticizing and questioning the fact that we are in fact getting some security for the money that we're spending. And of course, remember, this is $350 billion that we've spent, and every year it means that an American household has to pay roughly $600 on top of everything else, on top of the how much they're supposed to pay for defense, on top of all the rest. So it's not small a small amount. So to actually address these questions, we have first we're going to have Clark Ervin. I met Clark, I guess 3 or 4 years ago, and actually I didn't meet him. I read about him, and he was like my hero because he was the IJ of DHS, and he was like the guy who was actually the strongest voice and most credible voice, the man that you love to quote when you're criticizing Homeland Security, because he was the IJ then. And he was like really, just really loud about how Homeland Security dollars were wasted. And just for that, he was my hero. And now Clark has joined the Aspen Institute and to explore the creation of a Homeland Security initiative. You have a new book out. It's Open Target. I was going to say this is not yours. Open Target that came out, a year and a half ago? And Clark and I have been actually debating each other several times over the port security issues. So Clark's going to go first. Then we have John Mueller. When I started working on Homeland Security issues, and because I was pretty controversial in what I was saying, everyone was saying, you need to meet John, you need to meet John, you need to meet John, and as soon as I met him, it was obvious why we needed to meet. John is a professor of political science at Ohio State University. He holds the Woody Hayes Chair of National Security Studies. He has his latest book is called Overblown: How Politicians and the Terrorism Industry Inflate National Security Threats and Why We Believe Them. John, Clark, and I actually were on 2020 on the John Stossel special on terrorism threat in February, I believe. John has written a huge amount of things with really funny names like Capitalism, Democracy, and Ralph's Pretty Good Grocery. There was another one which was Capitalism and the Milk of Human Kindness. Anyway, I really recommend that you go and read a lot of what John has written, because he's a great scholar. Finally, we're going to have Cindy Williams. I've met Cindy now, 6 or 8 months ago. And again, I was like, wow, this is great. I'm actually not alone. There are people who are way smarter than me who are doing fantastic research. And Cindy is definitely one of them. She's a principal research scientist of the Security Study Program at MIT. Before being at MIT, she was an assistant director at CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, where she led the National Security Division in studies of budgetary and policy choice-related defense and international securities. Anyway, I'm going to leave the panel to you, Clark, and enjoy. Once they're done, they're going to talk for 15 minutes. We're going to open the floor for questions. Have very good question, aggressive, controversial questions. I'm sure they're up for it.
Let's see, then I am. Oops, that's okay.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Veronique, for that introduction, and thanks to you and to Brian for the invitation to be here. I'm not frequently called a hero, so it's very nice of you to call me that, even though my name is Clark Kent. I think it's very appropriate that we meet here today to talk about the Department of Homeland Security and whether we have gotten maximum bang for the maximum number of bucks that we have expended on Homeland Security these past few years, because as you may not know or remember, tomorrow, as it happens, is the 5th anniversary of the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. As you know, I was the first Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security, and I was one of the small number of people who began work at the department on its very first day, exactly 5 years ago tomorrow. So terrific timing on your part and that of Brian, Veronique. I guess the best way for me to start is by setting the scene from my perspective on this particular issue. As some of you know, among several things I do is doing commentary from time to time for CNN. And I was recently asked to appear on CNN to talk about a recent incident that you may have heard about on an airplane. On an airplane recently, a young woman was groped by a man who was sitting next to her. And eventually an air marshal who was on the flight was pressed into service to detain the groper and to sequester him. And ultimately, at the air marshal's direction, in consultation with the pilot, the plane was diverted and the man was subsequently arrested. The issue for me as a security expert was whether the use of the air marshal in this instance was an appropriate use of air marshal resources. I felt at pains in the beginning of my remarks, in the middle of my remarks, and at the end of my remarks repeatedly to stress the point that I do not support groping. I think that's a very bad thing. The guy should have been arrested for it. I'm not sure that the plane should have been diverted, but the guy certainly should have been arrested. He should be fined, etc., etc. However, I do not think that that is an appropriate use of air marshal resources given how few we have and how important it is to preserve their anonymity, and also given the potential, I'm not saying that this was the case in this particular incident, but the potential that that might have been a casing effort on the part of terrorists, or it might be in the future if they learn that air marshals can be diverted in this way, then that might be a very good way to get air marshals from doing what they're supposed to do, and that is to prevent terrorist attacks. Similarly here, I want to stress at the beginning of my remarks, in the middle of my remarks, and in the end of my 15-minute remarks, that I agree with virtually everybody. I guess the only potential people who might disagree with this are people on the payroll of the Department of Homeland Security who arguably are paid to disagree with it, that we have not gotten whatever the numbers are, $350 billion of Homeland Security in the last 5 or 6 years. There's no question but that precious Homeland Security dollars have been wasted. Now, we all know that government dollars are often wasted, that they're frequently wasted. To some degree, they're always wasted, but it's particularly egregious when Homeland Security dollars are wasted, because every dollar less that we spend on Homeland Security purposes is a dollar less that we have to actually make ourselves as secure as we possibly can. And I can cite example after example of this. You know, we've spent $20 billion plus on aviation security since 9/11, much more than that, but at a minimum of $20 billion. And still, as I'm sure you've read and seen, screeners, airport screeners, are no better able at spotting concealed guns and knives and bombs today, in 2008, than they were in 2001, right after the terror attacks, or than they were in 2003, 2005, when I was the Inspector General and I was conducting my own post-9/11 tests of aviation security. We still don't have an effective counter-technology against liquid explosives, even though a plot to blow up multiple jetliners over the United States involving liquid explosives was fortunately foiled, as we know, a couple of years ago. Not by our government, by the way, but by the British. And even though we, in the United States government, have been on notice, at least since 1994, of the vulnerability of our airplanes to liquid explosives, because Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind of the first World Trade Center bombing, used liquid explosives on a plane successfully to kill one man as a test of that technology. That's why we still have this limited ban on liquids and gels in airplanes, because we don't have an effective counter-technology despite the billions we've spent on aviation security. You know, I would argue that the number one threat to this country is nuclear terrorism, and certainly one of, if not the most logical ways for terrorists to slip a weapon of mass destruction, a nuclear weapon around the country, would be through one of the cargo containers that come to our seaports. And yet, we still don't have effective radiation detection technology. Just a few months ago, as I'm sure you read in the New York Times or the Washington Post, this new technology, advanced spectroscopic portals, at a cost of $377,000 each, almost $400,000. The Department of Homeland Security was on the verge of certifying that these machines actually had a much better detection rate than the machines that we had spent $200 million plus since 9/11 to deploy, machines that could not distinguish between deadly radiation and harmless radiation that naturally occurs in bananas and kitty litter and other such things. Now, this new technology, we've learned, contrary to the representations of the Department of Homeland Security, don't have a 95% detection rate, but in fact, their rate is as low as 17%. At times, and it's never any better than 50%, and yet we were about to spend $400,000 per machine to deploy this new technology. Another example, you just saw in the Washington Post just last week that the Department of Homeland Security is now going to scrap the Homeland Security Information Network, this web portal intended to link state and local law enforcement officials to the Department of Homeland Security's intelligence resources regarding threats against the homeland, and the intelligence resources of the larger intelligence community as well. And that has cost more than $90 million. We all know about the problems with the Coast Guard Deepwater project, this $24 billion multi-year, multi-decade program to modernize the aging Coast Guard fleet. There have been billions of dollars of cost overruns with regard to that project. And then finally, I would cite an example from my own tenure as Department of Homeland Security Inspector General regarding the Boeing company. We discovered that the Boeing company was overpaid by at least $50 million with regard to a contract to deploy and maintain explosive detection machines at airports around the country. We learned that actually the work of installing and maintaining those machines was done by the two subcontractors. And so we could have cut out the middleman and saved ourselves $50 million had we not contracted with Boeing, had the department not done. So, as we say in the law, I stipulate that there has been vast waste with regard to the Department of Homeland Security, and we have not gotten bang for our buck. However, one should not infer from this, as some people do, and as you may hear today, that there is not a real terror threat. I believe that there continues to be a major, and when I say major, I mean existential, terrorist threat to this country. We know from classified intelligence, and we know from open source intelligence. Bin Laden himself, Zawahiri, other terrorists have been quite clear about this, that they remain intent and focused on attacking the homeland. There is no question whatsoever about their intent. In terms of their capability, the good news after 9/11 was that we did have the terrorists on the run, and we have to give the administration, of which I have been rather critical, even though I was an administration appointee, as you know, we have to give the administration credit for that. But the bad news is, as we saw in the most recent NIE released 6 months ago or so, that Al-Qaeda Central is back in business. So we really now have the worst of all possible worlds. We continue to have these proliferation of Al-Qaeda-inspired cells all around the world. And Al-Qaeda Central is back in business somewhere on the Pakistani-Afghan border, and it's stronger than at any time since 9/11. The NAE says that they have probably already spirited operatives into the United States to carry out another attack. And then in terms of all vulnerabilities, relates back to the expenditures that we just talked about, that I just talked about, the vulnerabilities in terms of aviation, in terms of ports, in terms of mass transit, in terms of land borders, in terms of critical infrastructure and soft targets are vast. There is a cornucopia of target-rich opportunity for Al-Qaeda to strike. It seems to me that the only reason why we haven't been struck in the last 6 years is because, and they have said this themselves on the record, Al-Qaeda wants the next attack to be even more spectacular than the last one. If all they wanted to do was to cause a one-off suicide bombing attack on a bus stop or at a shopping center or at a restaurant, as happens routinely in many countries around the world, it would be very easy indeed to do that. Instead, they want something to rival 9/11, and it takes longer to plan, it takes more operatives to carry out, it takes more money to finance, and there are more chances for such a plot to go awry. But there is no question as to intent and capability and vulnerability. Now, I would readily agree, and I guess I've said this implicitly, do politicians hype the terror threat for political purposes? Absolutely. That happens on both sides of the aisle. Democrats do it on occasion. People in my party do it on occasion. Is there any question but that industry often hypes the terror threat in order to line their pockets? Certainly industry does. Is there some danger that in focusing on the terror threat to the United States, we will become our own worst enemy by divesting ourselves of our own civil rights and civil liberties? Absolutely. And I think the abuses of Abu Ghraib and the eavesdropping abuses that we've read about over the last few years are examples of that. But those are symptoms of a disease rather than the disease itself. And let me close by focusing on what I think we ought to do about the fact that we're not getting value for the dollars that we've spent on Homeland Security. The answer to that is not to spend less money on Homeland Security. In fact, I think we should spend more money on Homeland Security. You know, Veronique touched on a distinction that is often made that I think is very important and that lies at the root of much of the problem that we have with regard to Homeland Security and counterterrorism. A distinction is often made between Homeland Security and national defense. I was at a hearing 2 or 3 years ago, it was 2005, 3 years ago, just before Secretary Chertoff took office, and it was a hearing among think tank experts to kind of set the stage for the incoming secretary as to what the priorities should be for the incoming secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. And interestingly, you had experts from the left, from the Brookings Institution, and experts from the right at the Heritage Foundation, all arguing for the expenditure, the appropriation of significantly more money for the Department of Homeland Security. Whereupon, one senator, Senator Domenici, by name, stopped them and said, you know, gentlemen, you're going to have to recognize that there's just not going to be significantly more money for the Department of Homeland Security. We spent billions as it is, and if we're not careful, we're going to wind up spending more money on this, namely Homeland Security, than we are spending on the defense of the nation. And when he said that, it was as if a light bulb went over my head. I said, you know, aha, there really is this bifurcated thinking to some degree on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House and at some quarters on Capitol Hill, that there is a difference between Homeland Security and national defense. I would argue that they are and ought to be thought of as part and parcel of the same thing. For all the difficulty that we're having in Iraq and Afghanistan, at least we have the mightiest war machine in the history of warfare, defending our interests there. And as between threats to our armed forces, our military installations, our diplomatic installations abroad, threats from nation states, which are the threats that, generally speaking anyway, the Department of Defense is designed to counter, as against asymmetrical threats from terrorist groups against the American homeland, we're far better protected with regard to the former than we are with the latter. We're far more vulnerable with regard to the latter. So we spend somewhere around $500 billion with regard to the Defense Department, and somewhere around $50 billion, as we've said, with regard to the Department of Homeland Security, about a tenth. Now, I don't pretend to know exactly what the figure should be for the Department of Homeland Security, but I would argue it should be closer to the $500 billion figure than the $50 billion figure, because again, as between the threats from nation states and the threats from armed forces, the threat to the homeland from terrorist groups is far greater, and we're far more vulnerable to it. Now, I hasten to add, there must be controls in place to ensure that additional Homeland Security dollars are not wasted, as all too often the dollars in the past have been wasted. So let me close with my recommendations as to how to treat the disease as opposed to the symptom itself. First of all, the Department of Homeland Security itself should define its contract requirements when it goes out to contract with contractors for devices and goods and services to counter the threat to aviation or port security or mass transit or whatever it is. All too often, the department has allowed contractors to tell the department what it needs. There's the example of the SBI contract, where shockingly, the now departed the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Michael Jackson, famously told security contractors who wanted to bid on this project to secure the borders to tell us what we need and then design that system. Well, surprise, if you allow a contractor to determine what you need, that contractor will decide that you need more than you need. Needless to say, and it will cost more than it needs to cost. Secondly, the Department of Homeland Security needs to hire far more procurement experts than it's hired. There are still just a handful, 100 or so, to ride herd over this vast army of defense and Homeland Security contractors who dictate the business of the Department of Homeland Security. Third, I would argue that there should never, ever be no-bid contracts. I can't conceive of a single circumstance that should ever admit of having a no-bid contract, even if we all know that there's only one contractor that is capable of providing whatever the good or service is at issue. There's still a value, it seems to me, in letting out a contract for bid, because we might discover that there are other contractors who are equally capable of providing the good or service, or who could do it at a lesser cost than the known bidder. And it's always good to survey the market and find out whether, in fact, as we expect, we're getting the best value for the dollar. Furthermore, needless to say, and this comes as apparently heretical in Washington, there should be performance incentives for timely and accurate and effective performance with regard to Homeland Security contracts. And conversely, there ought to be penalties, including fines and withheld payments and disbarment, ultimately, from future contracts for contractors that consistently fail to deliver with regard to Homeland Security contracts. And I would argue, and this is really heretical, that under certain circumstances, we should even consider, and if the law needs to be changed in this regard, criminal penalties against contractors that can be shown to have repeatedly and knowingly failed to deliver what they promised, because that ultimately endangers the national security of the United States. Furthermore, I'm very concerned about this practice, which happens all across Washington and happens all the time with regard to the Department of Homeland Security. A recent Washington Post article, again, with regard to the Deepwater project. Some 7 to 10 former officials at the Coast Guard are now in leadership positions, either as employees, senior managers, consultants to, lobbyists for, or board members of Lockheed Martin or Boeing, which in the past have been major contractors for this Deepwater project. There should be a means of disallowing contracts when it can be shown that the contractors are employing people who have played a senior management role with regard to the program at issue. If we did that, it seems to me, you would see more examples of officials in government ensuring performance, as opposed to looking down the road to the time when they're going to leave government and perhaps get a job with a contractor, which of course gives them an incentive not to care that much about the performance of a given contractor during their time in office. So it seems to me that that has given us some food for thought, and I'll end it there and wait for questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Let me begin with a disclaimer here. I'm here speaking for myself, and none of my views should be taken to reflect those of Woody Hayes or of any of those football players, particularly the bigger ones. What I'd like to do is three things, or one thing and two parts of another. I'd like to talk about the threat, sort of following up what Clark is talking about, and then talk about the issue of trying to do cost-benefit analysis in this area and give a couple of suggestions about that. Let me first talk about the threat and remind you of a few things that have happened since 9/11. Giuliani said that at the time of 9/11, he and every other security expert he talked to thought that there'd be dozens and dozens of these attacks over the next years. And he said it hasn't turned out to be nearly that bad, and quite obviously he's right. Exactly what those security experts were basing their ideas on is obviously pretty questionable. But they got together again in 2003, 200 or 300 of them, and they basically agreed 75 or 80% that there would definitely be an attack in the United States before the next year's election, and that probably this would be done with weapons of mass destruction. In 2004, Attorney General John Ashcroft declaimed with FBI Director Robert Mueller standing next to him that there was almost certainly going to be an attack during that election season, that Al-Qaeda had 90% of its preparations put together. His recent book, Ashcroft's book called Never Again, strangely enough, doesn't mention that episode. During this period of time, there's also a quest to find Al-Qaeda in the United States, and officials were saying in 2002, 2003 that there were between 2,000 and 5,000 Al-Qaeda agents in the country. The FBI by 2005 came out with a report, which is still secret for some reason, indicating they haven't been able to find a single true Al-Qaeda cell anywhere in the country after spending huge amounts of money looking for it and expending money that previously had been used for going after things that actually do happen, such as organized crime and white-collar crime and so forth. They don't open cases on those often anymore, but are now chasing after terrorists and have so far not found any. According to a press conference last June 2007, that number, namely 0, remains the case. Basically the same number as the number of weapons of mass destruction that were found in Iraq. They continue to follow up leads. The New York Times recently noticed that the transit people were saying that 1,944 people had called in tips on the tip line, and they congratulated people for calling in. The phrase was see something, say something. Then the New York Times reporter actually asked them how many of these tips led to anything, and the answer was 0. They have picked a few locals. The clown who was going to take down the Brooklyn Bridge with an acetylene torch. People who are going to go to Chicago and blow up the Sears Tower if they go and find out where Chicago was. And some of these people may actually be a little bit dangerous, probably mostly to themselves, and it may be good to have them under lock and key, but it doesn't exactly present an existential threat in many respects. If you look at what Al-Qaeda has done since 2001, or Muslim extremists outside of war zones, there's 2 lists, one from this town, one from CSIS, the other from the RAND Corporation, listing every Muslim extremist terrorist attack outside of war zones since 2001. It makes for fairly grim reading. It includes obviously Bali and all these other, and London and Spain and so forth. But the total number of people being killed outside of war zones by Muslim extremists comes out to be something like 200 or 300 per year. By contrast, over 300 people in the United States die drowning from bathtubs in each year. So that basically it's not clear that there really is that much of a threat out there. At present rates, your chance of being killed by a terrorist, international terrorist, if you live outside a war zone, over 80 years is 1 in 80,000. That used to be the same number as the chance of being killed by an asteroid. However, they've now retired some of the risk on asteroids, so I bring you good news. Your chance of being killed by a terrorist is now higher than it was being killed by an asteroid. That also, by the 1 in 80,000, assumes that there's another 9/11 every several years somewhere in the world. If there isn't another 9/11, then it's more like 1 in 130,000. Your chance of being killed in an automobile accident, by contrast, as an American, is 1 in 80, not 80,000. Okay, the only way this can be changed, basically, is if Al-Qaeda and the bad guys come up with weapons of mass destruction. Probably have to be nuclear weapons. I've been working on a study on that, which I'm going to skip over now because there's some time, but my calculations are the chances of them doing that are something like 1 in a million, maybe even 1 in a billion. I'm glad to talk about that more. There's just so many steps you have to go through sequentially, and so many of them are difficult, that even if you have a 50-50 chance of each step, there's so many of them that it comes out to be those astronomically small numbers. Okay, let me turn now to the cost-benefit issues and just give you 2 sort of perspectives on this, since I only have like 8 minutes or something left. One of these is, I think, very strongly agree with Clark and a lot of other people that cost-benefit analysis now really ought to be applied to this situation. There's a top economist at the Department of Homeland Security whose name is Gary Becker. He is, as it turns out, not the Nobel laureate, but at a conference 2 years ago in Los Angeles, he said, "We really don't know a lot about the overall costs and benefits of Homeland Security," which is really impressive since, as Clark points out, we've been, and Veronique points out, we've been spending hundreds of billions of dollars on this, and essentially we don't know what we're doing. Some of Clark's comments obviously reflect that as well, waste and confusion. At any rate, I'm working on a paper now which is almost complete, working with a risk analyst and construction engineer from structural engineer from Australia, a guy named Mark Stewart, and he had this brilliant idea, I think, of applying value of saved lives to Homeland Security. It's a standard process required by OMB and FDA and so forth, is to, if you do this, how many lives will be saved and how much will it cost to save a life, value of a saved life. And for example, seatbelts, it costs about $100,000 and that saves one life. Seatbelts in the back seat cost about, overall, costs about $3 million to save one life. The general thinking is that if it costs more than, say, people vary obviously, and this is a tricky kind of situation because you're talking about human life. But if it costs more than $1 to $10 million to save a life, it isn't worth doing it. It's much better, for example, to spend money on more seatbelts or policing the seatbelt law, for example, which will have much more lives saved. So what we wanted to do is apply that to the overall Homeland Security budget. And so what Stewart's idea was, and I've been chiming in on this as a junior author, was to look at the increases of Homeland Security spending since 9/11. At the time of 9/11, it's something like 20 or 30 billion. Now it's about 60 billion, including military and some other things. So basically, it's $30 billion in increased expenditures each year on Homeland Security. And so the question is, that's the cost. That's the increased cost. We assume that the Homeland Security, as they were before 9/11, would continue on. So you'd still have the Coast Guard, you'd still have border control, you'd still have airline security, but it would be at a different level, at a lower level, presumably. So the question is, how many lives has that saved? Well, we got various estimates in it, but let me use Dick Cheney's number. On television a few years ago, about 2 years ago, he said, Homeland Security has saved thousands of lives. Okay, well, that's almost certainly a number made out of whole cloth, but let's take it. If it's really the case that it saved thousands of lives, what does that come down to be per year? Well, roughly 500 a year. If we save 500 lives a year, spending $30 billion on it, what's the value of the saved life? It comes out to be about $60 million per saved life. Way out of so it fails the cost-benefit calculation. If you use more realistic numbers, it can be $600 million per saved life. At any rate, that calculation ought to be be considered, it seems to me. Maybe it's worth it in some sense. There's psychological issues and so forth, but it basically isn't there. Okay, so anyway, that's one study. The other study I'm working on is comes out of my book Overblown, is looking at protection of targets. And what I'd like to do is just sort of set out some of my thinking as it is at this point on protecting targets. It doesn't include policing, and it doesn't include mitigation issues. But the things, what is it worth protecting? And they're very, and it comes out to be almost nothing actually. There's various problems in sort of sorting this out. First is that there's nearly an infinite number of targets. The second is that any given target has a probability of almost zero of being attacked. That some target somewhere might be attacked is not zero, but that any given target it's almost zero. Furthermore, terrorists are not like hurricanes. Hurricanes, because they can change targets if it doesn't look good. So that hurricane, for example, doesn't come in toward Tulsa and look ahead and say, wow, everybody's in shelter, so I'll hit Oklahoma City instead. But a terrorist can basically do that. And in Israel, for example, there are a couple of cases in which a suicide bomber couldn't get into a mall. Found it too difficult to get into a mall. So what he did instead was he went to he blew himself up on the street. So the question is, what's the advantage from society's standpoint? Clearly, if you're in the mall, that was a good thing. If you're in the street, not. So basically, that forms a sort of a major problem in trying to deal with this. You simply can't make very many things invulnerable. If you do make them invulnerable, the terrorists will find another target. And the idea of trying to come up with a meaningful target list, in other words, getting in the mind of the terrorist, is just a hopeless enterprise. So basically, what you have to do is sort of do a few comparisons. One is with a null case. If we don't do anything and use the money we saved trying to protect things that are very unlikely to be hit, how much is it worth? How much does it cost? If we don't do anything, we save that money and use it to compensate the victims and rebuild the property, are we better off or worse off? You also have to include things like unintended consequences that come out. For example, there's a study coming out of Cornell, 3 economists have put together, which indicates that since 9/11, there's been a huge drop-off in short-haul flights because of the cost and inconvenience of getting on a plane. So consequently, people are driving. Of those people who drive because they didn't fly short-haul, about 400 are dying every year. The traffic fatalities are that much higher, which is more than Al-Qaeda has killed per year since 9/11. So the TSA is right up there with Al-Qaeda in that limited sense. There's also opportunity costs. If you're spending this kind of money and not doing it on things like enforcing seatbelt laws, is it basically cost effective? The opportunity costs that would come out of that. So anyway, that's some of my thinking. Generally, when you start applying this to real things, it's very hard to see that anything is worth protecting. Nuclear power plants make sense, but they're already being protected. Chemical plants, maybe. You might find a few icons like the Washington Monument. On the other hand, how much does it cost to protect the Washington Monument? If it blows up, how much would it cost to build it again? On the other hand, there'd be a big embarrassment with that. You might want to count that in. There's a few things. There may be a few things like that, but mostly it comes down to airplanes. Protecting airplanes tends to make a fair amount of sense, not because blowing up an airplane is worse than blowing up a bus in a physical sense, but that if you blow up a plane, people don't fly planes anymore. Whereas if you blow up a bus, people do keep traveling on buses, as we saw in Madrid and as we saw in London. And even that's very questionable. Once again, what I'm dealing with here is increased expenditures since 9/11, so we assume there's a certain amount of spending that would be continued on. Okay, let me end on that cheerful note and turn it over to Cindy.
So I guess you could say what I've been looking at is what is the technical route we've been taking to get where we are? What is it about the processes that we're using to decide where the money goes for Homeland Security, how much we spend on Homeland Security as compared with defense, the thing that Clark talked about? How is it that we decide what's a top priority, what's a lower priority, what's the risk? What is it that we're doing in the organizations, the processes, and the tools that surround the allocation of resources to Homeland Security? And I've been looking in the White House, in the Executive Office of the President, OMB, the Homeland Security Council, and the National Security Council. What is it that's going on in the Congress, and what's going on in the departments and agencies themselves that have a big role in Homeland Security, that's somehow preventing us from not wasting money, that's allowing us to continue to waste money, even though there are people of good intent in all of these places who really see this as an important problem and want to do it right. What is it that's going on? So I'm going to talk about a few things. The first is just how much are we spending. Both Clark and John mentioned this a little bit, but I'll show you a chart with what we're spending on Homeland Security in the various departments and agencies of the federal government. And then I want to go back and ask, why did people say we needed a Department of Homeland Security in the first place? Back in 2002, when the law was passed that said we're going to have a department, and the day the department opened its doors, 5 years ago tomorrow, what were people thinking would be the big advantages of consolidating so many functions into a single department? And then I'm going to check on the progress toward the things that people were hoping for. And then I'm going to blame a big lack of progress in those areas on these things that I am looking at, the processes, the organizations, and the tools that have to do with allocating resources. And I think we probably won't have time to talk about recommended remedies, but you'll get an inkling of where I'm going with this, and if we want to talk in Q&A about that, we can do that. So let's start with the budget. So both speakers so far have mentioned that we're spending about $60 billion, $61 billion in 2008. This is the president's request, and it's no doubt changed a little bit in the appropriations, but it's hard at this point. It's hard until OMB does their work of explaining what really is being spent in 2008. It's hard for me to say what's really going to be spent, but it's around this amount. About half of that you'll see is in the Department of Homeland Security, just under $30 billion, just under half is in the Department of Homeland Security. Basically, there are 5 other departments that are each spending more than $500 million a year on Homeland Security. The big one is Department of Defense, Department of Justice, Health and Human Service. Those are the biggies. So, what was it people were saying? And this is advocates of having a new department were saying these things, but also then the director of the Office of Homeland Security and later the first Secretary of Homeland Security, Tom Ridge, was saying all of these things. They were all saying, well, the first thing is you'd get unity of effort. You'd be able to consolidate all these various efforts of the federal government under a single cabinet secretary, and that cabinet secretary could get everybody singing from the same sheet of music. And even better, that cabinet secretary could have an idea in his mind about what the top priorities are and what the top threats are, what the main risks are, and based on those ways of thinking, that cabinet secretary could press down into budgets his top priorities. So it wasn't just that everybody be working together, singing from the same sheet of music. It was also that you could press down in your top priorities. And then the third thing was it would be so much more cost effective, because when you had all these little agencies, all these multiple departments working on Homeland Security, everybody was doing what they needed to do to get their job done. But as they did that, there could be vast amounts of duplication in what they were doing. And so by consolidating, we were going to save money in all the agencies that were brought together under this single umbrella. And in fact, Secretary Ridge, before he came secretary, before the department was formed, said straight out that he was convinced we'd save so much through consolidation that the new functions like analytic work in the Department of Homeland Security, plus all of the management overhead, would be completely paid for. So, of course, my heart's been broken after those promises, and I'm just going to take you through the various ways that my heart's been broken. The first thing is this unity of effort thing. Well, how could it even have made unity of effort when, in fact, half the Homeland Security total budget is not even in that department? So, okay, we've put half the work of Homeland Security for the United States federal government under a single cabinet secretary, but the rest is off somewhere else, right? Who's pulling that under a single umbrella? Well, that should be the Office of Management and Budget plus the Homeland Security Council up in the White House in the Executive Office of the President. But in fact, they have all they can do just to work immediate problems, and in the case of the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, to try to figure out what's being spent on an annual basis on Homeland Security in the various departments and agencies. Forget about having some kind of top-level plan where you think from the top down, we need more over here in the Department of Defense and less over there in the Department of Homeland Security, or FBI, Department of Justice needs more, but we haven't spent but we're actually spending more than we need in health and human services on the bioterrorist threat. So there is no top-down planning of that type. And I'll just mention, within the Department of Homeland Security, even if you thought that the secretary could get his or her arms around at least the 50% of the Homeland Security budget that's in that department, well, you have to remember that that secretary has other fish to fry, because there's 36% of the budget for the department that's not related to Homeland Security at all. In the Coast Guard, for example, there's a search and rescue mission. So nobody has any way of pressing top-level priorities down in right now. Okay, what about the notion that even if we didn't get unity of effort, at least we could be allocating the money to the various projects that we have based on a notion of threat and risk? Well, you already heard from John that there's really very little analysis of risk going on. The one place where you hear a lot about risk is in the grants that go to state and local governments. There's a huge amount of work done on deciding how to spend those dollars. That's about 10% of the Department of Homeland Security budget for Homeland Security. It's about 5% of the total federal spending for Homeland Security. So you could get that risk exactly right and you still would have made virtually no difference. Where you need to think about the risk is the kinds of things, the questions that Clark and John are putting to you, right? Is this important at all? How do you trade between this kind of defense and the offense that the military is doing? What about inside the Department of Homeland Security? Should I have more border work, or should I have more spent on transportation security agencies? Should I spend more on finding nuclear weapons or nuclear materials at borders, or should I spend more on preventing them from even getting out of the former Soviet Union by locking them up through our prevention programs? Nobody's really doing that kind of risk analysis, and we need that. So what's happening as a result? What's happening as a result is that there are 6 main components, operating components in the Department of Homeland Security. And each of those operating components is basically being told, you get the same amount of money that you got last year plus the same plus up everybody else is getting. Tell us what you're going to do with it. That's basically what's going on inside the Department of Homeland Security. And the result is that if you thought you were going to see big shifts inside the Department of Homeland Security budgets from border patrol over to transportation security, you haven't seen it. If you thought somebody was going to think through what are the priorities, what matters more, let's shift that money, you haven't seen it at all. And in fact, these are the numbers. What I've done here is I've gone back to 2003, the day the department opened its doors, and then compared with the 2007 and 2008 budgets. And I'm asking here, what percent of the total Department of Homeland Security budget went in each of those years to the 6 main operating components? Secret Service, FEMA, the operations part, not the grants part, the Coast Guard, Transportation Security Administration, and so on. What percent went to each of those? And over the years, about 3/4 of all the department's money has gone to those 6 agencies. And what I see is that no more than 2%, in almost all these cases, no more than 2% of the budget, of DHS's budget, has shifted from one to the other. In other words, nobody's starting with top-down priorities and saying, oh, we should be spending more on this than on that. Instead, the agencies are basically getting the same share of the pie as they got the year before. Now, it's an expanding pie. DHS budget has gone up by about 40% over these years, DHS's internal budget. But, and with that increase, you would have thought this would be a perfect time when budgets are going up. Nobody has to suffer with shrinking. in these 6 operating units. Nobody would have to shrink or give anything up. They could have a boost for inflation, right? And still you could put more money on something than on something else. And it hasn't happened. The one exception here is that CBP, Customs and Border Protection, has some extra money in 2008. That's because of the Secure Border Initiative. Okay, what about that saving money? How's that going for us? Well, basically, no redundancies have been cut. And in fact, there's obvious overlaps still in terms of air forces. CBP, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Coast Guard each still have their own air forces. They buy the airplanes separately. They operate the air forces separately. You know, you would have thought there would be a great place for redundancy. And in fact, internally, the Department of Homeland Security did a study asking what are the areas of redundancy, what could be cut. That study was done right after the department stood up, and none of it's happened. And the upshot of that is that the budgets for central administration and new elements have tripled, while the major components still keep their same 75% share that they always had. So what went wrong here? Well, one of the problems is in the White House. It's that the Executive Office of the President, meaning OMB, and the Homeland Security Council aren't working the way they need to around Homeland Security, and part of it is organizational. Homeland Security Council is very weak, very understaffed. The OMB has this one unit that pulls together the Homeland Security Department work, but all the other work is left out of it. The other 50% of Homeland Security spending. And there is no explicit top-down way of matching priorities to budgets or budgets to priorities. There's also problems inside the Department of Homeland Security. They have some people who should be doing trade-off studies for them, but instead they're all tied up doing performance reviews, not doing trade-off studies. And they're very weak inside the institution, and they're very junior people and very understaffed if you really wanted to be doing tough trade-off studies. The secretary himself hasn't been attending to the process at the beginning of the process or at the end of the process that they've set up for themselves. And so it just leaves everybody sort of on their own to decide what they want to do. There's a problem on the Hill as well. Congress, the jurisdictions, especially on the Senate side for the authorizing committees, are all over the map. There's splinter jurisdictions for every piece of the Homeland Security Department, not to mention the full federal effort for Homeland Security. And I also think that CBO is very underpowered in the area of Homeland Security. They haven't really made this switch to have enough analysts. They would need Congress to say, we need the studies, we need you to add analysts, we're going to give you the resources to do that. And I just want to make one more point. There is no budget function for Homeland Security. National Defense, that Clark mentioned, has a budget function, 050. International Affairs has a budget function, 150. That's the way we pull everything together in something that really matters to us in the federal budget. That's the way we pull a look together. It also makes sure that the budget committees take a look at the wider set of national security and Homeland Security functions. We don't have one, and I think we need one, and I think I'm getting the signal, so thank you.
Thank you. So now we have a microphone and going around. If you have questions, please shoot.
Thank you all very much. To go to the microphone, and we hope that you enjoyed your time as you were listening to our panelists today. Don't forget to fill out green forms as you leave. Helps us to continue to improve these courses. And lastly, please don't forget to come back tomorrow and see Veronique and her presentation. And if you would just call on people, Veronique.
Hi, I'm Matthew Allen. I'm a staff on the Homeland Security Committee, and I have a question for Mr. Ervin and Ms. Williams. Firstly, Mr. Ervin, you said that Congress should, perhaps statutorily, instruct DHS to begin contractor performance incentives, set the own requirements for contractors, and possibly include penalties for contractors. And I just wondered, often, especially in areas which are very technical, the department asks contractors to set priorities because you have policy people that need to make highly technical decisions. And these people cannot take the time to learn the incredibly broad spectrum of technology possibilities that could be employed. So that's generally why that outreach is done. And I wonder if you mean that could be overstepped, or if you think DHS should hire people specifically to do that. And then when you talk about, I wonder if you could just comment on that, and then when you talk about instituting performance incentives and specifically penalties is very scary, specifically from the congressional point of view, because as we've seen, if there are not incentives and if there are strong penalties, commercial companies may decide not going to do it. It's not worth the risk. We saw that enormously in biodefense, where nowadays biodefense companies flee Homeland Security initiatives, and they have a hard time justifying to their board of directors that they're going to spend money researching pharmaceuticals for the national stockpile when there's very little commercial interest, because there's only one customer, and there's an enormous penalty where you get no reward on that investment if the government decides to not buy your medicine at the end of the day. So I just wondered, there are certain things you recommended that could actually drive people away from investment in Homeland Security areas.
Well, I think those are both terrific questions, and to answer them in the order that you posed them, I am proposing that the department hire its own technical experts. I think whom you work for has a lot to say about where your loyalties lie. It shouldn't be the case, I would argue, but human nature is what it is, and given that human nature is what it is, that is the case. Now, obviously, that costs money to hire these technical experts, and technical experts can make a lot more money, obviously, in the private sector than they can in the public sector. That said, I think there are people out there in a country of 300 million people who are willing to make lesser money than they can make in the private sector, provided it's a more competitive wage than it presently is, who would see this as a national security service that they would be willing to provide. So that's the first thing I'd say. On this issue of whether we would dry up the market for Homeland Security goods and services if we were to incentivize, if I can use that term, and penalize contractors, I'd simply say that course of action, incentives for good performance, penalties for poor performance, is par for the course in every other sector in the economy. We do that all the time in the private economy. There's no reason whatsoever why we could not and should not do that in the public sector here with regard to the Homeland Security Department. Are there, at least in theory, some contractors who, depending on what the penalties are and what the incentives are, if the penalties are too high and if the incentives are too low, they might not get involved in the Homeland Security sector or might discontinue their performance in it? Of course that's the case. But there are lots of contractors out there, point one. And two, another thing I would point out is that part of the problem, I think, in the last few years is that the Homeland Security Department market has been really dominated by the larger contractors. There are lots of smaller contractors out there that presently exist and would exist if it were easier to break through the Homeland Security market. So, the devil's in the details, of course. And, if the incentives and if the penalties are common sense ones, if there is adequate compensation for good performance and not undue penalties for poor performance, but if it's carefully calibrated, it seems to me, that's the right way to get, the only way ultimately to get the kind of performance that we're all looking for with regard to Homeland Security.
I should ask that I would implement the incentive and the penalty mechanism to lawmakers. But that's me. Next question.
My name is Kevin Gunderson. I'm with the House Homeland Security Committee. I have a question for the professor. You stated in your remarks, you referenced the New York Times article about see something, say something. And you listed a statistic, I think it was 1,400 cases that were investigated, and none of them ended up, giving any results in terms of a potential threat. And you say it as though it's a bad thing. And when I say it, a bad thing, as though situational awareness is a bad thing. And just as an example, last week on Friday, a gentleman was found with a shotgun right up the street across from the Supreme Court. And he was found because he asked directions. And somebody saw it and said something. So, okay, he wasn't Al-Qaeda, but he clearly could have killed anybody in this room that walks around here all the time. And I use it as an example because you just pointed it out as though it was a bad thing because there were no tangible statistics that could give you, a percentage. It just seems as though that's kind of an irrational way of thinking because you can't tangibly get a number on somebody seeing something and saying something as though it's a bad thing. So I just wanted to get some more remarks out of you on that.
Yeah, is this on? Is this on? Well, I can just shout. There's an article last Tuesday in the New York Times by John Tierney who referenced this. It was 1944 asked, don't, and it led to zero. The issue is basically how much time are you going to spend bashing your head against brick walls, chasing blind alleys, and there's huge opportunity costs. I mentioned in passing about the FBI. It's not going after white-collar crime. It's not going after organized crime. It's not going after a lot of things because it's spending. No one in the FBI wants to be the one who made a slip-up which caused another 9/11. And so consequently, that's a huge cost. What Tierney also stresses in that is that fear is costly. There's a study, for example, several studies now apparently, I knew of a couple, but now there's more recent ones, indicating that fear of terrorism actually increases the danger of heart disease. So consequently, if you're going to cause people constantly to be worried about terrorism, and when basically it's not happening, there's that kind of cost as well. And we've now had, we have now had 7 years of this effort to try to find these guys with zero results, according to the FBI at least, in terms of real Al-Qaeda cells. And it's quite possible that we're wasting a fantastic amount of effort chasing after spooks that basically don't exist. And we ought to consider the possibility that that money could be much better spent really saving lives in other endeavors.
Can I just add a footnote to that? I completely understand and agree with, by the way, the premise that prompted your question. But, it is not fashionable, God knows, to quote Don Rumsfeld nowadays. But occasionally, it seems to me, he said some things that made some sense. And one of the things he said, in another context, admittedly, but the point remains, is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And the fact that the FBI apparently can't find any terror cells in the United States does not mean that there are not any terror cells in the United States. We all know that there are. And even if
they're in the country, you know that somehow.
And even if we didn't know that they are, it seems to me that the prudent thing to do is to presume that they are and to prepare accordingly.
But how much time and effort do you spend?
How many more hundreds of years are you going to do this?
Well, certainly I'm not suggesting that somebody shouldn't look at bank robbery cases and child porn and organized crime and drug trafficking and all the very serious crimes that FBI formally spent most of its time doing. What I am saying, though, is that somebody ought to be dedicated full-time to terrorism. Should that be the FBI? Should that be the Department of Homeland Security? Should that be some MI5 type organization that we set up? Those are all legitimate questions, but somebody needs to do it.
Or if your assumption is correct that there are in fact cells in the United States, shouldn't we be actually questioning our method of investigation, that they haven't been able to come up with them?
Sure. That is true. I mean, I don't disagree with that, but if you look at the last 2 attacks by Al-Qaeda in this country, one was in 1993 and one was in 2001. So based on those numbers, tangible numbers, 8 years, we're going to get hit any time now. Is it going to happen for 100 years, as you said? I don't know. But are we going to sit here and say, well, the numbers don't show that it hasn't happened yet. It's only been 1 in 1,450 chances, or it gives somebody heart disease. That's not reason to say that it's not going to happen. I just think that people are getting, because it hasn't happened in 7 years, it kind of goes out of people's thinking, because we haven't found cells in every city. we could. And as you said, there has to be some mechanism that does look for that.
Yeah, just eventually you got to get to a point where you say they don't exist. I mean, absence of evidence is not evidence of existence. And the opportunity costs are very high in these cases. There's huge amounts of money are being thrown at this problem with amazingly smaller amount of results. Furthermore, the most likely consequences of most of these terrorist attacks, if you look at the guys who tried, is really quite limited. I mean, people would get killed, but it would be, to try to prevent that is spectacularly expensive. And if you want to save lives, you should do things like lower the speed limit on private passenger automobiles to 13 miles per hour. That will, with certainty, save 35,000 lives each year of Americans. If you're going to try to, or if you want to make perfect security in airlines, just ground all the airliners. Obviously, we don't buy either of those arguments, and we're willing to accept a certain amount of risk because getting it down to zero is very costly and has other consequences.
One of the ways also maybe to think about these issues is like, if we have the certainty that it's going to happen, let's say every 7 years it happens with probability of 1, right? It's like, what is the best way to prevent it? And it seems that from what we've seen and what we've talked about, the way we've been throwing money at absolutely every target, no matter how worth it is to protect it or not, or like, we've been throwing money all over the place, might not actually be the way to go after this, to try to prevent this event, right? So there are different ways of thinking about it. Even if you think, whether you think that it's not going to happen or that it's going to happen, I actually think that we haven't thought about it the proper way. And actually, that leads me to a question that I think is important. I mean, this target issue seems to be really one of the main issues we have to think about. So there are an endless number of targets, right? I think one of the questions that we ought to ask systematically when we're talking about protecting something, and that I never hear, I've never heard when I've talked with people on the Committee on Homeland Security, when I've talked with people at DHS, is like, can we actually protect this target in a cost-effective way? The assumption is always, well, yeah, and it doesn't matter. We can throw as much money as it takes. But this is really the wrong way to think about it.
I actually disagree with that. I think people assume that if a terrorist wants to attack any target, they can. It's like you said, if you put up a wall around a nuclear plant, they'll go to a chemical plant. I think we have to assume that it's going to happen and we have to do something to try to stop it. So I think that's actually wrong.
For every single target, it's worth spending...
Harry McDonald's?
That's not what I said. I said the government has to assume that it's going to happen.
Which target? There are over 800,000 targets now that have been listed. They're not all, we shouldn't weigh them all the same. And it still remains. The question, I think, still remains. Can we protect this target? This is a question I would like to hear asked. Is there a cost-effective way to protect a target? Even if we're talking about a target that we think is likely to be attacked. Even when we're thinking of a target where, if successfully attacked, would have devastating consequences, we ought to start thinking about whether we can, in fact, protect this target. And if we can't, or if we can, we do what we can. And if we can't, we should move on to actually protect another likely, with high consequences, devastating to another target, and then ask the same question. But I don't see that asked ever.
Well, I mean, I agree with you, Veronique. I'm not suggesting, and let me stress this, I'm not suggesting that we can or should try to protect every single target in the potential target in the United States. We can't do that. And we shouldn't spend an unlimited amount of money to protect even the most significant targets. We don't have an unlimited amount of money. I'm all for risk analysis. I think one of the good things about Chertoff is, unlike Ridge, who I think it's fair to say essentially had an in-box mentality as secretary, whatever is the issue of the day is the issue I'm going to focus on, at least Chertoff has said we can't protect everything, and therefore we have to identify the most significant targets in the country and then analyze everything in terms of risk, vulnerability, and consequence, and also priority. So the bad thing, though, is that the department still, to this day, 5 years later, has not developed a creditable and manageable list of the most critical infrastructure sectors and sites in this country. We can't have a list that has hundreds of thousands of things on it. But we can develop a list, it seems to me, of the things that are most significant in the United States that would have the greatest consequence in terms of loss of life, injury, economic damage, and psychic damage to the United States. And the final thing I'll say is, and then I promise that I'll be quiet, but this notion that John has that we can equate the deaths from a terror attack with the deaths from car accidents or the death from cancer or marauding deer. We've done online exchanges where we've talked about this issue. Yes, the numbers can be the same or even smaller with regard to a terror attack than these kinds of things. But what that ignores is the psychic damage that a terror attack does to the United States. That is incalculable. If tomorrow 300 people die from cancer, which we know will happen, probably more, and tomorrow 300 people die from a terror attack, which one's going to wind up on the front page of the newspaper? The latter. Why? Because of the psychic effect of that. Because of the economic damage. What was the economic loss to this country because of 9/11? It was $500 billion, if not more. So we just can't equate those two things. And the final thing I'll say is that I have no brief for Dick Cheney either, but John mentioned him earlier, so let me mention him. There's this 1% doctrine that Ron Suskind's book is based on that Cheney articulated. And I think it makes some sense. That is, even if there is a 1% chance that certain things are going to happen, and what he was talking about, of course, is nuclear terrorism, that justifies, I would argue, as he did, a 100% effort to prevent it because of the catastrophic and game-changing, if I can use that term, consequences of such an attack.
And yet his administration didn't do that.
I am the first to concede that the administration's rhetoric has not matched its record, or vice versa. But that's an argument for getting the record and the rhetoric in balance.
But I'm looking at the book that you have in front of you, Our Own Enemies. Isn't that the premise of this book, which is one that I'll agree with, is like the reason why, first after 9/11, the economy bounced back tremendously. It's quite remarkable. And this is why I'm in America and not in France anymore. It's like the resilience of American entrepreneurs is always fascinating. But it's also the fact that the reason why the psychic element stays with us, it's because of what we do, what the government, the policy that the government implements and doesn't let us forget. When I have to strip down naked, when I go to San Diego, when I go to take a flight, I can't forget about 9/11 because I'm taking off my pants.
Did you really have to strip down naked?
Pretty much.
No.
Took off your shoes.
Well, actually, once, I ended up in my bra once in Reagan because the guy didn't see that I had the T-shirt that was under my shirt was actually part of my sweater, and he asked me to take it off, even though I told him it was the only thing I had. So that was fine with me, but not with them, obviously.
That brings up an interesting point. I don't think anybody in this room has ever gotten naked in the airport. I could be wrong. If you have, your shoes are...
Come on, having to take off your shoes.
You shouldn't have gotten on the plane. But is it really that much to ask that we take our shoes off?
Do you know what the cost of the economy is of actually the 2 extra hours? It's pretty, you cannot...
Does it matter?
Yes, how about...
2 hours of your time? Just be realistic.
No, it costs the economy $16 billion. Don't you want to count that?
It's actually probably 50 billion.
90 minutes early to ensure that you're not going to die on the airplane. It's a cultural thing. Hold on, think about it. You can't. It maximizes the chance.
Well, it doesn't because TSA agent actually let weapons and things like this go through anyway.
I didn't say the system was perfect, but my point is...
The other thing that is important to ask is also, haven't we actually prevented any other 9/11 type of event to happen by reinforcing cockpit doors? We have. So why do we have to actually go through the charade, the TSA charade? And here, John and I would disagree on this, but I actually, and maybe theater security is something that is important. Maybe it is, and I don't have the data. But I actually think it is. I think you ought to start questioning the fact that, in fact, when you're going to the airport 2 hours ahead of time, you are, in fact, preventing your own death. And I think this is like a supposition that you cannot make. It's just like, are you saying that if they weren't TSA, each time you would fly, you would die?
No, I didn't say that. I said there's less likely of a chance that somebody's going to sneak a bomb into a plane in their shoe when everybody on the plane takes their shoes off. I don't think that's too much to ask of somebody to get on an airplane to fly. I feel fine waiting 90 minutes.
It has a
Yeah,
tremendous
it's just that.
I think that just brings up another issue of a cultural thing. We want everything to be secure, but we're willing to sacrifice nothing for security. An hour at the airport, standing there, reading the newspaper. Can you take your shoes off? Sure.
No, but it's killing 400 people a year because they're not flying, they're driving instead. You have to build that into consideration. You have to say the terrorists would kill more than that.
They're not killed because they didn't go on an airplane, John.
They don't fly because of the long delays and the increased costs, not because of their shoes.
John, they weren't killed because they didn't fly on an airplane.
That was
Yes.
their choice